Okay, good evening. Right, let's share a few ideas on Parshas Emor. Pasuk says, "Leikru korcha b'rosham, fa'asakonom leigalichu." There's that. That's near the beginning. Yeah, that's the class. If it's familiar, it's near the beginning. Right. Perek Chof Aleph Pasuk Hey. Sam told me this morning. Sam Vecht. The aliyah, third aliyah this morning, weekdays, is the shortest aliyah in the year. They're short psukim as well. The first two segments. Yeah. So anyway, so the pasuk is Kiddush Hashem. So that's right. So the question is, we understand these rules and what the reason, what the rationale for them is. Rashi asks the question: why is it that Kohanim are told not to tear yikru korcha, leave a ball patch for a mace, or not to not to shave with a razor? And Rashi goes into detail why it is these things are mentioned specifically with Kohanim when also they apply to Yisraelim. We learn one from the other, even though it's true the rest of the Yisraelim are also not allowed to do so, but there are various things you learn one from the other, expanding each way you learn from them. Again, each one basically, there are three halachas here. Each one applies both to Kohanim and to Yisraelim, yet they are emphasized for a particular reason here, and it's one of these cases where basically each place fills in the gaps of the other place in terms of what applies to everyone. Kadoshim, next pasuk, Kadoshim Yulelokeim v'lo yichalalu Hashem Elokeim. And they should be kadosh to Hashem, right? We have to be mekadosh them. Beis Din has to be mekadosh them. And the question is asked by the Maharil Diskin, B'Shulei Diskin, and this helps explain almost retrospectively, because the kasha still remains, the problem still remains, that we understand that each is explaining a different angle from the other. But there is still a question as to why it's not all in one place then, about Israel and what about the whole of Bnei Israel. Why is it emphasized here in the context of the Kohanim, these particular halachas? And the Maharil Diskin says that in explaining these halachas in the context of Kedoshim, they have to be Kodosh, is that the Komrim, the priests of the idolatrous nations, they would do these practices, right? These changes, these unusual things to their hair. They would shave their leafy bald patches or scrape their flesh. Why? So that it should be recognizable. They wanted a sign that they were priests. You know, like in ancient Egypt, I think they used to shave their heads and they used to leave a bit of hair. All sorts of references in the Gemara to this. Various different countries and nations used to do different type of things. There was a visible sign. You can tell immediately who the priest is, even to this day, right? There are cultures where, there's an immediately visible, sign. Even, you go back in time in this country, monks would have a particular haircut. There are lots of different examples. They leave, what's it called? They would leave there's a name for it. They leave a circular bald patch on the top of the head. There's a name for it. Yeah. No, but there's a particular name. Yeah, there's a name for it. Anyway, whatever it is. But the point is that like this. They had to have a sign that they were Kohanim, they were priests. Says the Maharil Diskin, why is it they needed a sign? Because really, in their private lives, they were often doing all sorts of, things that were inappropriate. They weren't behaving priestly-like, right? All the Ta'evas Shabbat, he says, right? And therefore, they had to have a sign. They were saying, "Yeah, it's okay, separating. Yeah, I'm a priest. Even though you see me doing all sorts of things which look inappropriate, you should know I'm a priest because I act in some way." That's not to disparage everyone, but that was often the case, especially in the pagan world. That was often the case. That was the reality. Says the Maldiskin, you don't need to do all this. Because you have to be Kodosh in every respect. Anyway, your actions will demonstrate that you are Kohanim, right? As it says, and therefore you don't need all these things. You understand? He's learning the pasuk. The continuation is Kedoshim Yulekeim. You've seen them do all these practices, and you'll think to yourself, well, the air priests do all this stuff to show everyone they're priests. We should also have a simon, a physical sign on our flesh. We should cut ourselves or or shave our hair in a particular way to show everyone we're priestly like. No, Kedoshim Yirakem. You don't need it because everyone's going to know you're Kohen because of the way you live your lives, because the Kiddush Hashem that you make in your actions and the fact that you are consistent with when you are serving as a priest, as a Kohen, and when you're not, if you know what I mean. There's no distinction. It's a beautiful pshat, right? And that's why it's emphasized here in this way. Now, the Toras Chaim says, moving much later on in the parsha, but also the continuation of the theme of Kiddush Hashem, which is kind of the primary focus of this shir overall. The Toras Chaim says on the pasuk Perek Chof Beis, pasuk Lamed Beis, which is the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. It's often not noticed because since it comes at the beginning of the parsha of the Moedim, and in fact we include it in the laning for Yom Tovim. So it's often sort of neglected. You need the mitzvah of Espinosa. You're not allowed to shecht the mother and a young on the same day with the korbanos, etc. And then you've got the pasuk Shmarta mitzvah v'asisem somani Hashem v'lo yisechalu Hashem kodshi. This is Parshas Emor. This is the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. You shall not be machalel my holy name. When ikdashti b'seich b'nei Yisrael, I will be sanctified amongst the b'nei Yisrael and Hashem ekadishchem. Right? I am Hashem who sanctifies you. And this is the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. And then the next pasuk is Amotzi eschem me'eretz Mitzrayim, one who takes you out of Eretz Mitzrayim, liyos lochem le'elokim ani Hashem. So the Toras Chaim asks, what is the connection and the continuation between the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem and the fact that Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim? Rashi says Almanos Kain, this condition. The condition was, I'm going to take you out of Mitzrayim, but only if you live your lives as a Kiddush Hashem. That's what Rashi says. Almanos Kain, it's a condition, right? Says the Toras Chaim that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out of Mitzrayim with all the signs and wonders and the Nissim and the Floros and everything else and the Makas, the Shinui HaTeva, the distinction in the difference in nature, so too our very souls, right, the nefesh of the Bnei Yisrael also left, so to speak, the natural order, being under the natural world, being tied to the rules of nature. And that is how they are able to be Moshe Nefesh for Kiddush Hashem. That's his pshat. You'll ask yourself, how is it possible that a Jew is able to give up their life if the extreme would be necessary for Kiddush Hashem, that we say in Shema every day, even if he takes you on, you have to be prepared to give up your life for Kiddush Hashem. How can you get to that level? We live under the natural world, and that goes against everything. The human being, the body, screams out for survival, or survive against all costs. So how is it possible to achieve that level? The answer is the answer is because when you were physically taken out of Mitzrayim in a miraculous way, you also achieved a spiritual level, right, through that process, which will enable you to be gifted with the ability to rise above the natural order, what the body naturally wants to do to survive at all costs, and if it came to it, to be able to give one's life al Kiddush Hashem. And he says that when it says that's what it says. There's a pasuk in Yeshayahu which says Atem Eidai. Hashem says, "You are my witnesses," and that witnessing doesn't necessarily mean only by what we say to in other words, the Mitzrayim, belief in Hashem. It is that we, with our very selves, physically, are a testimony about Hashem and the way He changed nature to take us out of Mitzrayim, and therefore. And he brings the Ramban at the end of Parshas Emor, discusses this, how it works, and how this and the miraculous was this one-off occasion to show Hashem's presence and that Hashem runs the world. And therefore he says, and he goes on to say that this testimony applies, that the Bnei Yisrael applies in three different ways: the way we act, the way we speak, and the way we think. And therefore we also have 3 Yom Tovim the reference to Mikroi Kodesh is mentioned 3 times. There are Gimel 3 times Kedusha. We say Kodesh, 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 all 3 respects. And therefore, that is what happens, and that is what happens. That's how we express, if you like, ourselves. In fact, he says that this idea of Kedusha, the idea of Kedusha, follows its way through all of the primary of the Yom Tov. Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. Yetzias Mitzrayim is the action. Hashem changes nature for us to leave. Shavuos is speech, because that's Matan Torah, that's the Dibur, that Hashem gives us the Torah. And Sukkos is the Ananei Kovod, which is the Sukkos Sholem, the idea of Sukkos Sholem, presumably the idea of Machshava. The idea, he says, that the Sukkah is beyond the realm of of what we can really appreciate. It's the living within the protection of Hashem himself. The idea that would be linked to a process of machshava, of thought, as opposed to action and speech. Anyway, that is the pshat of the Sfas Emes as to why it is that the Yetzias Mitzrayim is linked to the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. Then we have the question, also linked on the same pasuk, is what is the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem? How does one perform the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem? And obviously, that's a whole topic in and of itself. But one particularly noteworthy point, and the way the Torah expresses the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, is v'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael. Now, the kedusha and the idea of Mekadesh Shem Shamayim has to happen within the Bnei Yisrael. B'soich b'nei Yisrael. The Baal HaTurim says here that the gematria of b'soich b'nei Yisrael is zeh ein omrim kedusha v'halchos me'asar. You don't say kedusha with less than asar. That's the gematria of v'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael is. Right? I think the word zeo as well. This is, you don't say kedusha with less than 10 people, and therefore he says also that that's the connection with the Yomim Tovim, because b'soich b'nei Yisrael, right, within the b'nei Yisrael, and immediately the Torah is going to go on to say, right, eila moed kodesh, right, moed Hashem shetikros on moed kodesh, eila hem moedoi. Why? Because on the Yom Tovim, that's when people get together. That is when we create a Kiddush Hashem. How do we create a Kiddush Hashem on Yom Tov? Because we mispalel, we say Hallel, and we praise Hashem. The concept of Barov Om Hadras Melech, that itself is a Kiddush Hashem. We come together for that purpose. We create a sanctification of God's name. That's what we do. That's for certain Israel. So the Ksav Sofer, though, adds a beautiful idea. He says that there's that there is a famous Chazal which says that the way Kiddush or Chas v'Shalom Chilul Hashem often plays out is specifically in the way people talk about or view someone who does who learns Torah, who professes to be an observant person. Famous Chazal. Mi shalom ad v'shona. Right, says Chazal, someone who learns and teaches Torah and everything else, and he speaks pleasantly to people, and he conducts himself in an appropriate way when how he relates to others. Everyone's going to say, this person who learns Torah, wow, what a Kiddush Hashem. That's what Kiddush Hashem is, right? Everyone's going to say, well, look at his actions, look at the way he behaves, look, he's a mensch, he's appropriate, he speaks properly, etc. to other people. But someone who Chas v'Shalom is the opposite. He might, if he learns a lot of Torah but doesn't behave appropriately with other people, people say, Zeh Shalom HaTorah, kama muchu orim in myself. So in other words, it's a dangerous thing, because the fact that he's a person who's seen as someone who learns Torah means it's a risk. It's a risk you have to take. You know, the benefit is, wow, people will say, incredible. Look at this person who learns Torah, what a Kiddush Hashem. But it can be the opposite, Chas v'Shalom, because people can say, look at this person who learns Torah, and look how he behaves, look how he speaks to others, look how he conducts himself. And that's a terrible thing. And he says, the Chovis Halavova says, like this, the Chovis Halavova says, Shapitchim, clever people, avelus belibom, b'tzola al pneihem. That clever people, they sort of keep their sadness inside, so to speak, but they manage, it's hard work, to demonstrate a sort of smile on their faces towards others. And he says that's a kind of a moshel. V'chein derech tzadikim, so he says with the tzadikim, she'einom misboidetim. They don't keep themselves to themselves. Ki murovim bein habrios. They are mixed in, they are involved with others, they are concerned about others, they relate to others. And in their hearts, they are close to Hashem and His Torah. Not that that's not outward as well, but he's saying that the Chovis Halavavos is saying that tzaddikim are able to bridge the gap. They're able to balance the two. They're able to be within, reflecting on the depths and mysteries of the Torah, closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but on the outside, they're also pleasant people to others, and they have a smile there, and they're, how are you? And they're with other people, and they're sensitive to the needs of others. He says, And if a person doesn't do that, that's a chilul Hashem. Because they will say, says the Kesef. So people say, because he learns Torah, doesn't know how to speak to people. So there's no greater chilul Hashem than this. Don't, he says, the Torah is saying, don't be mechalel shem shamayim, lo sechalelu shem kodshi, by being separate from people, because that's a chilul Hashem. Elatiat tzala al panechem. Make sure there's a smile on your face. V'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael. The Yodua, the Kiddush Hainu Pirish Tiu Prushim v'dodim b'levav b'libchem. The Kiddush is that you have this closeness to Hashem in your hearts. But I think what he's trying to say is that outwardly you are b'soich b'nei Yisrael, and that creates the Kiddush Hashem. When you're able to internalize deeply the need to learn Torah, to do everything you're supposed to do, yet it's always b'soich b'nei Yisrael. You're always and you're always therefore able to express that to others, and that creates the Kiddush Hashem. It's a beautiful pshat. The Ksav Sofer says that. The Ksav Sofer, yeah. Right. So now, just a few ideas from the Meshech Chochmah. Meshech Chochmah says, and this is on the Yom Tovim, the Moadim. So one idea that he develops, I'm going to share with you, if we have time, two ideas from the Meshech Chochmah. One idea that he develops is, you have the trajectory of the Moadim, the Yom Tovim in the Parsha, and we begin with Shabbos, and it goes through the year. You go through Pesach, Sfiras HaOmer, Shavuos. That's the second half of the Parsha, pretty much. Deals with the Yom Tovim. He says that if you look at the different types of mitzvahs, he says there are mitzvahs which bind Klal Yisrael to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and there are mitzvahs which tie us to each other as well. Makashim Yisrael zeh lo zeh. So, for example, he says you obviously have the mitzvahs of tzitzis and tefillin and mezuzah, for example, which bind us, which tie us to Hashem Himself, and then you have gemilas chasodim and trumas and maasros, which bind us to each other. And he says the same thing applies in understanding the distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov. Shabbos is lo yetze ish mimkomo. What is Shabbos? You don't leave your place, right? You're not allowed to carry. And he says those malachas, those particular aspects of malachas eichel nefesh asura. You can't cook, right? In other words, there is an aspect of Shabbos that we are, so to speak, alone. The idea, obviously, you have the malacha or not carrying, but it's also representative of a remaining at home aspect of Shabbos, an internalization of keeping ourselves to ourselves. He says everyone is, so to speak, by themselves, sitting and learning Torah and coming close to Hashem in that way. The opposite of this is Yom Tov in this respect, because Yom Tov has aspects to it which are designed, understanding on this level, to specifically bind Klal Yisrael together. How? Because on Yom Tov, the very aspects that you can't, these aspects you can do. Melechas oichel nefesh is mutter. And he says you're allowed to cook. And in your voyu elef orchim yefalem, all the halachas, right? You can cook. Maybe guests will come. Shema yavoy orchim. We did a whole share on that recently. Guests might come, etc. All these dinim of how you prepare food on Yom Tov and everything else. Ad ki omru. He brings the Gemara in Beitzah. There's no malchus, there's no lashes if you cook from Yom Tov to a weekday. Why? It's ingrained. It could be the guests will come. In other words, that aspect is ingrained within. You see that through the halachas of Yom Tov, that it's ingrained within the Yom Tovim, that concept of guests, right? The idea of reaching out, and of course, is represented more than any other way by the concept of Aliyah L'Regel. That's what you're doing, right? You're coming together. You're going up to the Yerushalayim, the Beis Hamikdash. We're coming together as one. That's what we're doing. We have simcha together, and that's why he says Haitzah, carrying, and Havara, lighting a fire from an existing flame, because otherwise it's not possible to come together in this way. But he says what's interesting is that if you look carefully, you will see this. Bonam Chatera, he says, if you look carefully, you'll understand. You'll see that this was a process. To develop this did not happen overnight, because on Pesach, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Peseach on the Botei Bnei Yisrael and skipped over, so to speak, the house of the Bnei Yisrael. There was not, the nation was not yet bound together in this way. On the contrary, we were still in our individual houses. We weren't able to leave the house. We were there privately. You had chaburus. You're beginning to learn. I think that's part of the answer. We're beginning to learn, but it's a journey. Rav Hirsch has a beautiful piece on this, the Parshas Emor, how the whole process and every aspect of the Korban Pesach that night was to begin to learn how not to be an Eved. An Eved lives only for themselves, right? And the whole process of becoming a Ben Churin is understanding you don't live for yourself. And therefore you have the mitzvah of chaburas, right? The whole idea is you can't do this by yourself. I don't want you just taking your own animal. I don't want a slave grabs whatever food they can to survive for that moment. That's what a slave does. So that's, on the contrary, that in a way that supports it. It's a process. However, they were learning this, and therefore he says with that because this is a process and because this is still linked at that stage, almost a link to the Shabbos type aspects, if you like, of the being sort of for themselves, so to speak. Therefore, it's only eaten limenuyov. You haven't reached the level. The people who are listed on before Pesach, you can't give it to anyone. You have to give it to people who have signed up to the Korban beforehand, right? So the idea of being able to achieve the level of guests might come is not there on Pesach in terms of the Korban Pesach. Shema Yavoy Orchim. Maybe guests will come. That doesn't exist yet. We're not down on that level, and therefore, in that respect, it's like Shabbos. It's like Shabbos. It has to be. They're not. They're only. But he says, they're not. They're attached to each other, but only in a distant sort of way, not yet in a firm way. The connection is through their central point, which is their connection to Hashem Himself, and therefore he says that's why you have the concept of Svartim Lochem Mimocharas HaShabbos. So he counts for Parshas Emor Mimocharas HaShabbos, from the day after Shabbos. That's Pesach. A famous thing, causes a lot of problem with the Tzedukim. Why is it saying Machas HaShabbos when Shabbos here, of course, refers to Yom Tov, right? This caused a lot of problems with Machas HaShabbos, right? Because the Tzedukim said it was a different day. So why does the Torah do it? There's a Meshech Chochmah, because Pesach is like Shabbos. It has within it those elements of like, you're not there yet. You're still in your Shabbos mode. You're still in your individualistic kind of approach, which is also needed. Shabbos is vital in that way. You need that personal connection. You can't just, if you live your life always on the level of Yom Tov, it's also not right. But you're still in that sense. You're in Mimocharas HaShabbos. Ad Mimocharas HaShabbos HaShvius, he says. Then when you get to the Mimocharas HaShabbos HaShvius, when you get to the end of the 7th week, then you are really connected in a much more revealed way, and you are there on that Yom Tov plane, that Yom Tov level and that Yom Tov plane. And with this, he wants to explain a famous question which many Mefarshim struggle with, which is, why is it that at the end of the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer, we have the mitzvah of Peah and the matanos to the Oni, right? Do you know this question, yeah? Perek Chof Gimel, Posuk Chof Beis, right? Everyone asks this. Rashi asked this, right? Rashi says, because to tell you that, why is this in the middle of the Yom Tov, in the mitzvah to give the gifts to the poor, right? Because it's like as if you built the Beis HaMikdash and you brought korbanos, and that's why you have the Yom Tov on each side. Right at the end of the sphere, just before what's it called? After Shavuos. In other words, you have Shavuos, right? Sfiras HaOmer Shavuos, and then at the end, just before Rosh Hashanah, right? You've got across the don't forget to leave Peah on Leket for the Oni. Why is that there? What's it got to do with Yom Tovim? Why is it on mitzvah the Matanos Le'aniyim? Says the Meshech Chochmah. Because now you've reached that level. Now through the process of traveling from Pesach to Shavuos, now you really understand what it means to give to the Aniyim. It's a beautiful pshat. Now you know you've got there. Now you can really do it, because now you're bound together. You've gone through that process of learning that you're not about yourself, and you've gone through Mimocharas HaShabbos, and you've lived through the process of a Shabbos as an individualistic life, and you've reached the level of Shavuos, and therefore you can properly give the Aniyim. And he says, "B'chol almost," says the Meshech Chochmah, with all nations, his kashrusim zeloseh hu nimusi. It's just like manners. It's a national thing. He says, we live together. We live in one country, so we've got to get on. Right? That's what we've got to do. He says, Baruch Hu has given us a different pathway. Because the link is to the Torah. The Torah wants us to develop this and build our lives in this way, right? And that is why. And in other words, it's so much more than just like, well, you live together, we have to live together, have to get on, so we have to support the poor. No, this is how I want you to live. This is the Chatchila way of living, to live a life in this manner. There was another idea. I'm just going to move on to another idea because we've only got a few more minutes. I just wanted to share with you in his Sefer Kiddush Hashem. He says, Leibovich, he says like this, that why is it end of the parsha, so what is going on with the Makalel? And this is really the antithesis, the biggest Chilul Hashem, right? The Makalel, one is Makalel, right? The curse, one who curses, right? Is the opposite, entire opposite. Says the Medrash, Rabbi Levi he left his world. He left his world, right? He didn't think about Olam Hazeh and didn't think about Olam Haba. He's lost everything, right? You understand? The Makala, how could he do that? He lost everything, right? So he says like this, that the reason that the Makalel sinned was because he did not recall at that moment that there would be a din v'cheshbon, that he would have to account for his actions. Had he thought for a moment, had the person who cursed, the blasphemer, had he stopped for a moment and thought, what's going to be? What are the consequences of my action? He never would have done it. Okay? And the Chiddush is, he says, is that the Makalel saw everything. He saw all of the miracles, all the Nisim and Niflos that Hashem did for us in Mitzrayim. Again, think back to that idea before, the idea of the Ksav Sofer. Was it the Ksav Sofer? Yeah. No, the Sfas Emes, where the Sfas Emes says, you know, Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, and the idea is that we're meant to therefore live a life of Kiddush Hashem. That's how we are able to give up our lives like Kiddush Hashem, because we live on a different plane. Now the Makalel saw all of that. He lived through that. He saw all the miracles and everything else, right? He saw the punishments that were visited on the Mitzrayim. He saw Kriyas Yam Suf, Kabbalah Satorah. He saw the Mon coming down every day. He saw the Ananei HaKovod, right? And even so, he forgot in one moment the basic foundation of everything, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu leads the world, that there's a din v'cheshbon, you have to give an accounting for one's actions. And he says this is a frightening thing, that you can have a situation, right? He says when people think about, do they need to learn Musa? So they think to themselves, well, I know everything. It's obvious. I don't need to go over all these things all the time. How, you know, and he says, no, on the contrary, you can see that you can have a person who sees the greatest miracles, right? And nevertheless, in one moment, he can fall and he can forget everything. And he says, how easy is us for also to forget the basics. And that's why he says you have to keep going over the basics so we shouldn't forget and fall into Averis Chamuras, the worst Averis. So really, this really is the other side of the concepts of Kiddush Hashem, which exists in the Parsha. The Yetzias Mitzrayim gave us the ability to rise above and to live on a plane which is really quite unbelievable. A person can be Moser Nefesh give up their life for Yiddishkeit, which is it's something we can't even. It's hard to get your head around. On the other hand, though, what we have to bear in mind is that the flip side of Kiddush Hashem is always there. Like the person who learns Torah, as we said before, and a person will say, they'll say, wow, what a Kiddush Hashem, but it's so easy also to create a Chilul Hashem. And so too, a person always has to be wary and aware that you can be exposed to the greatest miracles. You can live on the highest level, but you can forget everything in one moment of forgetfulness. So what we have to do, therefore, is always, in order to live a life of Kiddush Hashem, is basically spend our lives constantly strengthening this point in order that will be fulfilled in us. Wish you all a good Shabbos. Thank you for joining.